Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Benjamin Red. I'm joined by Nizar Hassan as always. Nizar, how are you doing?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great. We've got a whole lot to talk about today, and we've got a special guest as well.
Yes, it's a great comrade of mine, Islam Khatib, a Palestinian organizer and who is very involved in the feminist circles as well, and also teaches Islamic philosophy, and probably one of the smartest people who are in their early 20s in Lebanon. Welcome to the show, Islam.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And of course, today we're going to be talking about there were two really big events that happened this week. One of those was that there were just tons of Palestinians who went out into the streets to protest. There's a general strike going on. It's all because of this labor crackdown that's going on right now. And so Islam is here to talk about that with us. That's going to be our main topic, which we'll get to in a minute. But before then, the other main topic, the other main story of this week was, of course, the budget. And I think this has lately become my favorite topic, so it's unfortunate that this is sort of over at this point. But it is. It's finally on Friday, Parliament endorsed the 2019 state budget. They passed it 83 to 17 to 1, one abstention. And this came after several days of basically speeches, not really too much debate, but just like MP after MP getting up from Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, giving speeches and basically saying, like, I think a lot of them were basically shitting on the budget, but a lot of them voted for it anyway. So it's only, we're only 6 or 7 months late on this. And of course, that means that it's already time to start with the 2020 budget. So I can't be too sad that it's over with, because the 2020 budget has to be submitted to cabinet by September 1st. So theoretically, we'll get to do all of this stuff in like a couple of months.
You're already looking forward, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Like every time we do the budget, because we didn't have a budget for so long, I learn so much more. And so I feel like every time that I cover this, I cover it better. And that makes sense because it's such a huge document. Anyway, though, this week there were also a lot of strikes and protests that were going on during the meetings. Separate from the Palestinian protests, there were some public employees that went on strike, and veterans held really major protests down in Martyrs Square. They even tried to storm the parliament as voting began on Friday. But at the end of the day, they weren't successful in storming the parliament. And I think a big question remains as to how successful they were in negotiations as well. So what was done, we don't know everything yet, but like I said, the veterans were trying to argue against and protest against this tax on their pensions, and so we know something about this. I'm still a little bit unclear. We're recording this literally on Saturday, so the budget was passed less than 24 hours ago. Elias Musab, the defense minister, came out and said, don't worry, those who retired from the military under the rank of colonel will only pay like $2 a month or something like that. But I'm still not quite clear on whether this is the entirety of the measure or if there's some other stuff as well attached. So we're going to have to wait and see the actual, text of it to know exactly what happened here. Also, apparently there's a 3% tax on imports, which is up from the 2% that we thought it was going to be. But apparently MPs included some exemptions for gasoline, very important, and for goods that are already exempted under the value-added tax. So, basic necessities. Also, the Council for Development and Reconstruction's project budget was reportedly slashed by like $50 million. There's a big fight over Ogero's budget as well. And so this ends up being kind of sectarian here, because people saw like this as sort of an attack on the CDR and on Ogero, and also on the Higher Relief Council. And all three of these bodies are sort of seen as like the Sunnis' share of the state pie. And so like when they were talking about it, like Hariri actually like grew frustrated. He left the session at a certain point, and that led Nabi Berri, the Speaker of Parliament, to call a short break. Najib Mikati, the former Prime Minister, like basically the number 2 Sunni in the country, if you will, after Hariri, he withdrew from the session, and he said it like specifically in a tweet. He said like over the targeting of these 3 institutions. So that was a really big fight, and it was unfortunate that also took on those, sectarian dimensions.
But it's good to mention that the origin of the critiques against CDR, the Council for Development and Reconstruction, and the High Relief Council is that they are institutions that spend a lot of money without being accountable. And this is why a lot of people who, call for reforms in the state administration say at least there should be accountability mechanisms to make sure that they are spending the money in the right place, etc.
Absolutely, and we still have to see exactly what those. There were several accountability mechanisms that were proposed by the finance committee, and we don't know exactly. I have not been able to find out yet which of those have been actually made it through the full General Assembly of Parliament, and which ones were discarded on the floor of the House. So it's it's good. We got the budget passed, and everything's peachy, right? Well, yeah, not really. First off, we've got the question of maybe there will be a constitutional challenge, and this stems primarily from the fact that Parliament decided not to pass the closure of accounts for 2017. Well, they couldn't actually because Cabinet hasn't passed it on to them, and so this is a violation of the Constitution, and also there could be other grounds for appeal as well. One other big concern is that there are still these huge doubts. The numbers in the budget, they don't match reality.
Yeah.
And this was actually brought into pretty sharp relief this past week, because Riyad Salemi, the governor of BDL, the central bank, came out on Wednesday and he said BDL is not going to subscribe to treasury bills at 1% interest. The banks have already said this. They're not going to do this either. But this was built into the budget numbers, and it's supposedly a savings of $700 million, over 1% of GDP, is built into the numbers that Parliament passed. And so Parliament passed, really, it was, definitely fictitious numbers on this thing alone. It's a really, really big deal. So we'll see what happens. We'll see how the Cedra donors react, if they really believe that this is really as austerity and budget slashing as they want to see, because that's what they would like to see.
And it was very funny, the Salim Saadi comments that he made during one of the sessions.
SSMP MP for Kura,
who is known for saying too honest or a bit ridiculous things. Anyway, so he said that the IMF or the international donors know that we are lying to them about the budget and the deficit, and we know that they know that we are lying to them about the deficit reduction, so it's all fine, it's all good.
And everybody laughed. It's
we gave a high five to whoever was on his left. It was really funny.
Yeah, so we will see how the donors react to this. But for me, I think that's sort of beside the point, because really the whole idea here is, regardless of whether you're getting any money from the international community or not, Lebanon's finances need to be fixed ASAP in one way or another. And really, so Lebanon's left with no choice other than to figure something out here, regardless of whatever the international community says. To me, the stick is bigger than the carrot. All right, so speaking of numbers,
it's a very Benjamin Red transition, yeah.
of what we know, we actually got numbers for the first 4 months of the year, how much the Ministry of Finance has been spending, right? So that's one of the big questions, is the budget match up with reality? We got a taste of that reality. So for the first 4 months of this year, the Finance Ministry said that there was a deficit of $1.38 billion. And that's actually much lower than last year's. Last year, during the same period, the Lebanese government spent $1.91 billion. So if this pace keeps up, it would put the 2019 deficit at around $4.5 billion, which is about 7.7% of GDP, which is pretty damn close to what Cabinet said was going to be their target of 7.6% of GDP. It's almost magically close. But here's the thing. So two things could affect that. And these go in sort of opposite directions. Number one, new measures from the 2019 budget should reduce spending and increase revenues. So this should push that 7.7% of GDP percent. So this should push that 7.7% number lower. But there's rumors that the Ministry of Finance isn't really cutting spending so much, but putting off paying for things. So maybe they should have spent a little bit more during those first 4 months, but they put off the payment. So we're still going to have to pay it anyway. And if this is the case, then that's going to push the 7.7 number higher. Now, which of these is going to have the larger effect? No one really knows, except maybe some, wonks at the Ministry of Finance. But I strongly suspect that the latter is going to be the bigger influence. And I think, the IMF also agrees, like, we're not going to see a 7 or 8% deficit in terms of GDP. It's going to be higher than that, 9, 10 in that area from what it seems right now. One really quick side note on this. You might remember Riyad Saleh, the governor of BDL, telling all of us just a month ago that the January to April budget was less than $1 billion. So what the fuck? Dan Azzi, friend of the show, and Aley Mubayyad, who's an economist, suggested that this may have been, he may have been using accounting that was cash-based, just cash flow-based. And meaning basically that if the Ministry of Finance was supposed to pay you but didn't yet, they didn't count it in the deficit. Of course, if this is the case, then this calls two things into question. Number one, the Ministry of Finance numbers that were released this past week, and number two, the credibility of the governor of Banque de Liban. You can't have a governor coming out and saying, "Oh, it's less than $1 billion," and then less than a month later have a number that is much larger than that, 1.3 billion. That's ridiculous. And one final note on BDL. During the sessions of Parliament this week, at one point, Hariri sort of got into a bit of an argument, and he said that the IMF wants to float the Lebanese pound. Wah!
Yeah, Finally, someone of this kind of caliber said it. I mean, it was obvious from the reports, but they were never actually saying it very explicitly.
Yeah, so this is a really, really big deal, and it would be a big deal if this came to pass.
Basically makes all of us poorer.
Right.
Much poorer.
Yeah, it would be the end of like the Lebanese economic system as we know it.
Or maybe the worst kind of extension for it. Anyway, we'll discuss this later. But
yeah, that's a whole nother can of worms. There are reasons that it should be devalued for sure. But anyway, so that's it on the budget. Very quickly, I do want to note two quick things. Nawaf Moussaoui, who is an MP for Tyre for Hezbollah, submitted his resignation on Thursday, and he's been involved in a couple of incidents this year. So back in February, you probably remember this. We talked about it on the show. Moussaoui got in a verbal argument in Parliament with Nadim Gemayel. And he ended up making some perhaps true but intemperate comments about Nadim's dad, Bashir Gemayel. And that got him into a lot of hot water. Hezbollah suspended him from his duties as an MP for a period of 2 months. And then just not this past weekend, but the weekend before, he was involved in this sort of strange incident involving his daughter. She was forced off the road by her ex-husband, apparently over a custody issue. And there's this video that went viral about this. And then both were taken into the Damour police station. Moussaoui, the MP, showed up with about 20 armed men. And there are allegations that the ex-husband was stabbed with a screwdriver at one point, and somebody shot at the police station as well. Moussaoui denied this, but actually just last Friday, after Moussaoui resigned, the military prosecutor brought charges against him for his alleged involvement in this incident. So Moussaoui has had a lot of things going on. Regardless, I think this is kind of sad. He's generally, regarded as a pretty good lawmaker, knows what he's doing, knows what he's talking about.
And as far as I know, he was one of the few MPs who is supportive of the amendment to the domestic violence law to make it more clearly protective of women. So on that end, a lot of organizations are saying now, like, he was an ally, and it's sad to lose the only ally in the Hezbollah MP and the Hezbollah bloc.
And the other thing, of course, that we have to note here is that cabinet is still suspended. Its work is still suspended due to the Kabr Shmoun incident. As of today, Monday, it has been 20 days since cabinet tried.
Here we go again. You're counting days.
Back. Well, it's a situation where you have to start counting the days again because Jesus fucking Christ, we're going into the 4th week here of this issue. True. It's been, as of Monday, 20 days since cabinet tried and failed to meet on July 2nd. And this past week, everything sort of fell apart again. Abbas Ibrahim, who's the head of general security and sort of the all-around big negotiator guy, he was put on the case, and he brought a proposal to Talal Arslan to refer this to the military tribunal. Arslan just shut it down and said, nope, I want it at the Judicial Council. So, I mean, Hariri said last week that that this coming week he's going to call a cabinet session, but that was before everything sort of collapsed. So really, we're no closer to any sort of solution than we were a week ago. All right, and on that, I think we should move to that other really big story that happened this week, and that's the Palestinian protests.
So first of all, I think we live in two different countries. I have no clue about the budget. I've been so detached. Anyway, so basically today is the 5th day since the Palestinian protests have started.
As of Saturday.
As of Saturday, right. Basically, what happened is that the Ministry of Labor has decided to include in its crackdown on foreign workers, Palestinian workers, which has driven everyone out of their houses into the streets in every Palestinian camp. There's a general strike. People have decided not to buy any Lebanese products. So things are a bit messy right now, and that's because of basically an old law but new measures that mean that any Palestinian that is working must have a work permit, which makes no sense because to have a work permit, you have to go through a very complicated administrative and legal process, which doesn't make sense for Palestinians that have been living in Lebanon for the past 71 years. And because there are certain documents you have to present to get your work permit, such as residency papers. So what's been going on is that the minister, Abu Sulaiman, has said that this campaign is not against Palestinians and it's only to organize like migrant or foreign and what he called as illegal migrant, workers in Lebanon, which...
And to be fair, he has been cracking down on a lot of people and not just Palestinians. So what was it, like a month and a half ago or so, he announced there was going to be a crackdown, gave a month-long, get your papers in order, everybody, then I'm going to start cracking down. Yeah. And then on, I think July 10th, he started to do that. And it started out like, I guess, not really in Palestinian, or certainly not in the camps, right?
Exactly. So it did not really start in the camp. I mean, the first company that was closed was in Shikka, and it was a ceramic company. So basically, like investigators from the Ministry of Labor passed by and asked the owner of the company, hey, show us your work permit. So we are talking about probably a person who has like thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank, and they're asking him for a work permit. So what happened next is that they entered some camps in Saida, specifically Al Hilwa, and then they went to Yumi camp. And what they said basically that all Palestinian workers or owners of shops, and here I have to specify between shops and companies because you cannot have a company inside the camp or outside the campus. It's much easier to have one outside the camp.
We will talk about the camps in a minute, but to understand what's happening now, what are the labor inspectors basically checking for in these companies? What are they doing?
So basically, they're asking every single worker to show, and the employers, of course, to show that the workers have work permits. This basically is in relation to the laws that were amended in 2010, the Article 9 and the Social Security Law, which basically exempted Palestinians from the principle of reciprocity because obviously there's no legal state of Palestine, etc. What happened then was basically all Palestinians can work but cannot benefit from the Social Security Law, even though they are included in it and have to pay, their employers have to pay 2% of the employees' wage. Even though these amendments were declared and everyone celebrated them, they were not put into action up until now, because the minister is saying that although Palestinians have to have work permits, we're also giving them these privileges. These privileges are basically that you can have a work permit at no cost and that you can, change it annually. So basically what people are saying is that, okay, if we have to have a work permit, how do we get a work permit? What are the certain documents that we need to prove in order to get a work permit? And this is what we're asking for now. And there is no clear answer for that. There is no clear answer because the law that is in place does not take the specificity of Palestinian refugees into consideration. If you're going to ask a residency, then we cannot have a work permit. So people are asking,
and why is that?
Because we cannot have to, like, refugees have been living here for 71 years, so we don't have any sort of document that states we are residents, we are only refugees, we are considered stateless. And also there is no clear legal definition of Palestinians in Lebanon. So they're divided into 3 categories: those who are registered with UNRWA, those who are registered with the state, and the non-IDs. So basically it's all a mess, a complicated mess, and there haven't been any clear answers, just like actions. And that's what's basically frustrating everyone. Basically, Palestinians have a 6-month extension to work on their papers, and that comes after negotiations with the PLO, which sent Islam Ahmad to Lebanon few days ago. He is the ex-Minister of Labor in the PLO, and he's also now in, like,
he's on the executive committee, right? And he was sent here by Mahmoud Abbas this past week, right?
Yeah.
To be sort of like the, okay, go take care of that situation type of thing. Yeah.
And his statement was that, the Palestinian-Lebanese relationships cannot be affected by details. So he basically said that the livelihood of Palestinians here is basically another, detail. So what is going on right now is that when they closed down certain shops and certain employees were kicked out of their work because they are Palestinian, people have, taken down the streets. They start protesting in all camps. The protests are still ongoing. And here comes the role of, like, people are trying to ask, what do we do now and how do we deal with that? And this answer has been, this question has not been answered until now. And that's mostly related to basically what the Ministry of Labor is trying to do, is basically include every foreign laborer in Lebanon in the law, and then forgetting the specificity of Palestinians.
Trying to include you as foreign labor, not taking into account that, well, you don't have, like, you can't possibly be considered in that category for a number of reasons that he should really know.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds obvious, but first of all, if you're a refugee, you cannot be treated the same way as an economic migrant, especially if you are deprived of the right to return to your land. If you are a refugee and you have inherited the refugee status from the previous generation, this just doesn't make any sense at all to be born a refugee and to live your whole life stuck in a country being a refugee, and then to be asked to have a work permit. It's just absolutely insane from like a basic perspective without even going into the details of the law.
And so, like, when Abu Sulaiman, like, for instance, he came out this past week and he said, oh, well, I'm going to make it easier to get work permits, and one of the things that he did was say that I think it was employers don't have to pay the NSSF contributions or whatever. You're saying that doesn't fucking matter, because that's really beside the point.
Exactly. And it's not only that also depends on, like, the goodwill of the employers. And we all know that, refugees are basically exploited by everyone here. So basically it doesn't make any sense. And most of Palestinians actually work in informal sectors that are not, companies that are not even registered or legal in that sense. So how can a company that, for example, is not really registered, even if it's Lebanese, go and apply for work permits? If you get the permit, you can get the privileges. And we cannot get the permit, so that's
because you don't have the documents.
Yeah, that's what's been going on.
So even a 6 month, even if this is true, that you've got 6 months to get all of your documents in order, you don't have the documents to get in order. So how do you possibly do this?
Exactly. And people can get a work permit if you edit, like, if you say what kind of documents that Palestinians in specific should apply to get a work permit. But also given, we have to take into consideration that most Palestinians work in informal sectors. So how does that add or play?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is something that comes to mind. I mean, the most informal sectors in the economy are the ones where the Palestinian labor force is most concentrated. So the labor ministry is already not even doing its job in inspecting the conditions of whatever work in agriculture or work in most of the informal sectors. So why do we expect Palestinian labor to be that organized when no other labor or whatever nationality in these sectors is organized at all? It's all based on informal labor. A lot of it is based also, as you were telling me before we started recording, on doing like different kind of jobs every day or every month or whatever, manual labor that can be put in place in completely different things. Like today I'm working in an agricultural field, another day I'm working in a shop, another day I'm working in transport or whatever. All of these things, or construction, all of these things are based on this informal and very precarious, very exploitative kind of labor. And the Lebanese labor law doesn't even even cover these people, so it doesn't organize them in the first place. So it's a bit strange that the ministry is expecting the Palestinian labor will be organized through this kind of crackdown.
Okay, so I think that we need to sort of step back here for a minute, because one of the big questions that I have, right, is just why the proportionality. And even Camille Abu Sulaiman said this week, in perhaps an ill-considered comment, he said that the Palestinian reaction is incomprehensible and nonsensical, which means, as minister, you should probably talk to the Palestinians and figure out why they're doing this. But see, me personally, I also don't know. To me, it seems as though, Palestinians have been mistreated for so many years in Lebanon. So why now? Why suddenly now? Is this just like the straw that breaks the camel's back, or is there some other reason? My indication from what we talked about before we started recording is that you have to go back a little bit and talk about the history of this, right?
I personally believe that whatever is happening and what will happen in the next few years to the Palestinian community in Lebanon has like strong roots in how the camps were formed and how the community itself were formed. So basically, when people arrived in 1947 and 1948, what happened is that, usually when there's war, in a neighborhood country, the camps are usually near the borders. I mean, Palestinian camps are not. Palestinians were actually brought into the cities because, businesses and companies were prospering back then. The economy was not like this, and people needed workers, and most of the refugees that came into Lebanon were actually farmers or peasants, and that was why some of them were hosted in Beirut and not all of them were in the south. And at some point in 1949, Michel Shihab basically said that, okay, we can put like certain refugees who have certain skills in certain cities, but we have to get rid of a certain number and send them back to Syria. Or maybe they can be, divided between Syria, Jordan, Gaza, which then was basically the thing, was basically like send the refugees back to their places or send them away, or maybe another host country can, have them. So what happened then basically was some refugees were sent back to, Syria, but Syria closed the borders on Palestinians back then, and then Palestinians were taken back. So what happened is that they also formed the new camps. So there were around 15 camps back then. Now we have only 12. Palestinians sort of started, to work in farms and companies, different sectors, different places. And up until like 2010, there weren't any legal mentioning of Palestinian refugees, even though they were working for decades.
So they were considered just as any other foreign worker?
Yeah.
Okay.
They were seen as, and I mean, we're talking about like the 40s and then the 50s and 60s. The migrant community was not that strong in Lebanon as it is now. The kafala system wasn't there yet. Obviously, people had problems, but at the same time, they were exploiting the refugees, so it wasn't that much of a thing up until like the 60s. And then you have when businesses were started by Palestinians who were coming from, Quds or coming from Hebron, and then hiring Palestinians here, and people were like, the economy was prospering even for Palestinians. So what happened next was the crisis that we all know as the Bank Entra crisis, and basically that led to banning Palestinians from certain,
They are banned from a bunch of like 70 professions that are exclusively for Lebanese.
That actually started back then, and including starting their own organizations, including civil organizations, which was very interesting because there weren't many. Anyway, so people were starting to, wonder what happens next. How do we deal with this next? How do we move on after, the crisis? Because what happened is that the crisis made many Palestinians lose their jobs and also their money. A lot of the time, people forget that part of history, because a lot of our families, had to sell their homes and had to sell everything they have because of the crisis. So they moved back to the camps. A lot of Palestinians, how we have like the informal camps. We have like in Wadi Zaini, for example, cities like that where Palestinians gathered after they got out of the camps. So they were pushed back into the camps. And that's very interesting because a lot of our history is basically the authorities, or I don't know, I'm just going to call it structures of powers, trying to push Palestinians back into their quote-unquote private sphere, and just to ignore the fact that they're existing, just invisibilized. So that's what happened then.
And that's what Intrabank was all about, right? Intrabank was this humongous, gigantic bank back in the 60s that was, it was basically when Beirut was the destination for a lot of Gulf capital. A lot of petrodollars were coming into Beirut, and it was sort of like the way station between, the Gulf and the West. But this bank was owned by a Palestinian, and there's too much to get into in here. But basically, there was this just collective failure, or perhaps even something more sinister happening there, where the banking sector and the powers that be in Lebanon basically decided we're going to let this bank fail, or we're going to make it fail. And it caused, it was a disaster on every possible level. It was a disaster for the Palestinians, most of all, as you're talking about, but it was also just a disaster for the Lebanese and the Lebanese banking sector, because you think that Gulf money came back? No, of course not.
So basically what we're trying to say here is that, through all of these different milestones and through the measures and the tensions that have happened, the Palestinians have been forced more into the camps, more into their little informal economies that in which they operate. And throughout the recent history, the modern history of Lebanon, we see many stages where this is very relevant. In the civil war, and after the civil war in Nahr al-Bared, and then war on Nahr al-Bared camp in 2007, and even very recently, actually, last year we saw the UNRWA cuts, where the U.S. administration said that it's withdrawing its contribution to UNRWA, which is maybe the largest employer of Palestinians in Lebanon, and the main supporter of most kind of activities within camps that are humanitarian activities within camps. So the cuts to the UNRWA funds was a very big blow as well to Palestinians. So Palestinian workers in Lebanon are stuck within the camps, stuck in low-wage jobs, banned from prospering in the national economy. And
now you have the labor minister going in even to that very last place where you can work and saying, oh, we're going to crack down here too.
Exactly. Yeah. And on that point, I think it's important to not to look at the labor minister as a technocrat at all in this situation, because he represents the Lebanese forces, right? And the Lebanese forces are competing with the other Christian political party that has adopted a very right-wing rhetoric that scapegoats refugees, and
they've been shutting down shops too. They launched another campaign, just a couple months ago, and so it seems like there's this sort of competition going on between the two main Christian forces in the country.
So basically, maybe we can portray it caricatural way as like maybe Basile is succeeding too much in being Lebanon's Donald Trump, so the LF wants to take away some of it, some of his momentum before he completely dominates Christian politics through this right-wing rhetoric.
So as you basically said, Palestinians have been like the political, arena for like several factions, not only like Lebanese and also Palestinian. But what's going on right now is basically a historical moment, I think. I think we've all been waiting for this. People are actually on the streets just with a political discourse, a very clear political discourse. And it's not just like about, hey, please give us our rights or whatever. No, it's actually like, hey, we've been here for 71 years and we've been dealing with this and this and this. And it's not only targeted, at the Lebanese authorities. It's also like having this kind of conversations that we've been trying to have for the past 5 years. I think I've been, I remember like back in 2015, it wasn't this clear and it wasn't this angry, and now there's this anger, and I think people are sort of, thinking of how to also, co-organize with other, communities that are also under attack, including like Syrian communities and also migrant communities. And then we also have the Lebanese communities, and here is where we think of how we can move forward with this, and with it not being just restricted to the camps, because I guess this is what everyone in power wants. They want everyone to be back in the private Palestinian sphere instead of being in the public Lebanese sphere, where you can actually be visible and not just invisibilized, as is the history of Palestinians in Lebanon.
And I completely agree that the Lebanese-Palestinian division has never been clearer to me than the last few days, right? The Lebanese sharing all kind of fake news, propaganda, whatever, about Palestinian protesters doing these outrageous things, like burning tires, which Lebanese protesters do every single day. And then like all the tensions that are being kind of manufactured in a systematic way, even if they happen spontaneously, but they are spreading really fast. And this is very concerning to me as someone who at least virtually has been reading and involved in our history and our history of civil war and pre-civil war history, where basically the same rhetoric was so advanced and so established that it provided the ground for a very, very deadly phase of our history. So everyone is worried now with the economic collapse that might happen, that social tensions will eventually rise and people will be killing each other or whatever, chaos will be happening. So with this new dimension, it brought a lot of fear, a lot of trauma back in the minds of a lot of people, Palestinian and Lebanese, about what's going to happen. And most dangerously to me, it's a blow to our whatever attempts exist to create solidarity. So here, I want to know how you're feeling about this in terms of organizing for the future. Do you see possibilities for kind of solidarity organizing in Lebanon? And what do you see as the most important challenges or priorities for you as Palestinian organizers?
So I honestly agree. I'm also terrified. Like, we're fucking terrified. But also at the same time, I think this is it, There are moments like, I don't know, I'm sure like our grandparents also had that moment when they thought like, yeah, this is it. This is whatever we're going to do now. I'm not sure, maybe. I think this is it in terms of, everyone is on fire right now. So what we have to do right now is go back into our communities. And even if that community is like your neighborhood or I don't know, like our families or like, I don't know, however small that is, I think this is the chance to bring people together, because the discourse that the Palestinians are providing is really very clear. They are saying, hey, we don't want to fight. We're not here against the Lebanese. We're not here against the Lebanese state. We are just saying that we won't be your scapegoat. And you won't be like, hey, we want to liberate Palestine and, at the same time, just like oppressing every fucking Palestinian living in Lebanon. So basically what they are saying is also very general and it's not really specific. And I think a lot of people can be on board with that kind of discourse. But what I really fear is that people have been very drowned in whatever specific divisions, even within whatever self-proclaimed civil society we have here. What they have to do right now is basically use this, because I don't think it's going to happen again. And I think people are really, when I say people, I'm just going to say structures of power are really trying their best to destroy whatever is going on. And if Palestinians together, how hard it is to connect people from Nahr al-Barid and Ain al-Hilwa together, and this happened. If that happened and there's a general strike, I think a lot can happen between Lebanese and Palestinian communities and also other communities that are under attack. And whatever form that takes, it should happen as quickly as possible before we let them once again, use whatever space we are offering up. So I think, you have to either act now or just like let it go as usual.
And I will add one thing maybe from my perspective to Lebanese people who are talking about this, who have maybe some sense of solidarity with the Palestinians in terms of human rights, but when they start discussing this, they slide immediately to some civil war discourse about Palestinian armed presence and the camps being like dangerous areas for Lebanon, etc. And this is very, very dangerous, because whenever there's someone is challenging the status quo, demanding basic rights as workers and as humans, there will be someone introducing to the public discourse another aspect that would kind of discredit this by making the conversation about something completely different. And this is about depriving these Palestinian workers who are protesting from their agency as political actors right now and putting it in the hands of armed factions and the Palestinian Authority and the Lebanese state, and having the conversations between them rather than on the ground, on the grassroots, as you're saying. So I would say this is kind of a red flag that we should be avoiding.
All right. Well, I think we have to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming and sharing with us. I now understand this topic a lot better than I did a couple hours ago.
Well, thank you so much, Islam, for coming on the show. It's been really insightful.
I was really happy to be invited here. I know it's hard to talk about this clearly, but yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, I think we need a few more Palestinian voices when we're talking about Lebanese politics.
There are. You just have to contact them. There are.
This is it for this week then. We'll come back next week with a new episode. Until then, I'm Nizar Hassan.
I'm Benjamin Red.
I'm Islam Khatib, guys.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast. Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Red, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.